These are scientists that traveled all over India finding these advanced yogis and hooking them up to see what was going on physiologically with them. And the conclusion from this year-long study was that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system. Now this is highly significant because the autonomic nervous system was called autonomic because it was believed to be automatic. In other words, you had no input into that system. And this is the system that's responsible for your reaction to stress and emotion. And it mediates that response. So when you get upset, when your heart starts to race, that's your autonomic nervous system. That's your sympathetic drive being activated. So the idea that these yogis could control that system introduced a new concept. And this concept is the concept of self-regulation. The idea that humans, through certain practices, can develop the skill of controlling their internal state. And that includes their body, their autonomic nervous system, their breathing, their central nervous system, virtually many different aspects. And this is a central tenet of mind-body medicine. However, it's a tenet which is largely ignored in modern medicine. In modern medicine, the patient is viewed as a passive entity. Now, jumping forward to the present, some of the cutting-edge areas of research we have in this area, one of them is so-called neuroimaging. It uses these large machines, this fMRI that you see in the background, which can scan the brain and look with high resolution at specific nuclei in the brain and look from second to second and identify what's going on in the brain and where. And this gives you a great sense of where meditation can be active, because you bring a meditator, you put him in the scanner, have him meditate, and then you can see how his brain works. And this picture here is Richie Davidson, one of the leaders in this field, and Matthew Ricard, one of the leaders, a monk who's a leader in the field of mindfulness meditation. And one of the kinds of studies that have been conducted using neuroimaging have been taking these advanced practitioners and putting them into the scanner and asking the question, do their brains behave in the same way as non-meditators or non-yoga practitioners? And the answer to that question is yes. And it matches what we see differently in terms of behavior. In other words, the changes that we see in brain functioning appear in structures that underlie the attention network and also those that relate to emotion and autonomic function. And we know that meditation is the control of attention. So it's not surprising that you're engaging the attention networks and getting better at doing that. It's also not surprising that you're engaging emotions and autonomic function through that self-regulation path. So the brain changes that we see are consistent with the behavioral changes that we're recording. Now, another example, another feature of the central nervous system is so-called neuroplasticity. This is the ability of the brain to change its connections and its structure. In other words, the more time you spend doing something, the more the brain responds by actually changing its structure in coordination with that change. It's like your biceps get thicker when you do a lot of weightlifting over the course of the month. That's muscle plasticity. If you're a London taxi driver, you have a map of London in there. And that takes up a lot of neural connections and blood flow and glial cells, et cetera, to take up space to give you that map of London. So the question is, if you practice yoga over the long term, do you see changes in brain structure as well? And the answer is yes. So this is a study that was done by our National Institutes of Health. And what they were looking at was cold pain tolerance, the ability to tolerate cold pain. And the yogis were here in the black dots. They had higher tolerance to pain than did the non-yoga practitioner. Furthermore, that area of the brain that's involved in pain regulation, in terms of the volume of that area, was larger in the yoga practitioners than in the non-yoga practitioners. And that change in volume was practice dependent. In other words, the longer you had been practicing yoga, the bigger that area of the brain has become. So not only, when you practice yoga over the long term, not only do you make behavioral changes in terms of how the brain behaves, you're also changing the brain structure itself. And that, of course, goes hand in hand with your ability to do these practices. Another example is this cognitive function called fluid intelligence, a high-level functioning, which we know deteriorates with aging. So this is the non-yoga practitioners deteriorating with age. And yoga and meditation in this study were shown to dampen that decline. In other words, there's an anti-aging effect on this high-level cognitive function. So there's something obviously very powerful and very important in the practice of meditation that is allowing the brain to maintain its cognitive functioning at a high level. Now, we're studying meditation. And meditation is, in its most simple definition, is the focus of attention. And it can be done in different ways. You can focus on a single point, so-called concentrated meditation, or so-called mindfulness meditation, in which you're meditating on the flow of thought or the flow of sensation. In any case, what you are doing is focusing your attention. When you focus your attention, your mind is not wandering. You have a choice. You can either focus your attention or you allow the mind to wander. It's one or the other. So not only are scientists starting to study meditation, they're also starting to study mind wandering. In mind wandering and meditation, the first definition that I'm aware of, it's a little uncertain, but it's likely the Upanishads predated Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. But this is the first citation of how meditation works that I'm aware of. So in the first quote here, this is actually talking about mind wandering. This mind of mine is extremely restless. The mind wanders among objects as a monkey does from tree to tree. So nothing has changed in 2,000 years in terms of the human brain. It's still the same kind of thing. You're sitting in the doctor's office and it's thought after thought after thought after thought. Mind wandering. So here's the definition of meditation. The man who has a discriminating intellect as his driver and a controlled mind as the reins reaches the end of the path, that supreme state of Vishnu. The analogy is of a charioteer driving with horses, and the horses are the thoughts. And the more you can control those thoughts, the more you can achieve a better state of mind. So that's the whole idea, control of thought, control of attention. Now, as I said, scientists are studying meditation, but now they're also asking this question of, hey, what is this mind wandering anyways? And so there's actually a study that was done by Harvard scientists, published in our premier biomedical journal Science a few years ago. And they studied mind wandering in the general public. Their main conclusion from the study was that people's minds wandered frequently, regardless of what they were doing. So here you go. You've just verified the Upanishads. Now, the interesting part of the study is here. People were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not. So that's interesting. Why would we have a lower mood state when we allow our minds to wander? Well, if you think about it, we're really geared for survival. So what is the content of a lot of mind wandering? It's actually analyzing mistakes of the past, predicting problems in the future. That's what we spend a lot of our time mind wandering about. All of that stuff is pretty emotional. It's pretty stressful. If you do that 24/7, 365 days a year, unabated, you're going to get a mood disturbance. Because what are you doing? You're feeding the limbic system. You're allowing the limbic system to go into that mood state and that emotional reaction and that stress reaction. And we now know that people who end up doing a lot of mind wandering and a lot of rumination are actually more at risk for mood disorders and ultimately psychiatric conditions. And we have evidence that meditators are actually becoming fairly immune to mood disturbance and psychological conditions. So, this is shown nicely in a study that was done in a neuroimaging scanner. What they did was they brought people in and said, meditate in the scanner. But when you first notice that your mind is wandering, this happens all the time in meditation, you have to catch yourself and then bring your focus back. When you first notice that your mind is wandered, press the event marker. So now they were able to scan the brain in the different phases of meditation. During the focus phase, when they were actually successfully holding their attention, and not surprisingly, it's the attention networks in the prefrontal dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that were activated. This is the executive brain. This is where the attention networks are. No surprise there. When the mind was wandering, the default mode network was activated. And that's a much more diffuse collection of brain regions that are being activated during that type of brain activity. So you can see these are very, very distinctly different. And we're now seeing a lot of evidence about this default mode network, that when it's allowed to take over, and you spend a lot of time in the default mode network activity, you are more at risk for developing mood disturbance. So we're starting to see the underlying psychological, psychobiological underpinnings of how meditation has these positive benefits in the mood state. Now, the other cutting edge area, which is just starting to be applied and has a huge future, is the idea of molecular biological approaches. This slide here shows the central dogma of biology, which is that genes make transcripts, which make mRNA, which make proteins. And it's the proteins that do everything in the body. This is what this is how the body functions. What we know about this is that there's input at many different levels. In fact, there's also input to the genes themselves. Now, you can't change the genes, but what you can change is their activity. You can turn genes off and you can turn them off. So, for example, if you sit on the couch all day long and eat fatty foods and smoke cigarettes and don't have physical activity, you are likely turning on tumor genes, cancer genes. On the other hand, if you adopt healthy behavior, you're probably turning those genes off. So the question is, does yoga and meditation do anything to genetic expression? And the answer is yes. So a couple of studies have been done. This is one that was done at UCLA. And what they used was a yogic meditation practice for chronically stressed individuals. And they looked at which genes were being activated. And in these chronically stressed individuals, they showed suppression of the expression of inflammation-related genes and the upregulation of expression of genes involved in antiviral and immunoglobulin responses. And what we know about chronic stress, of course, is that it impairs immune function. It causes inflammation. And so these yoga practices were doing things, the genes, the way you want them. In other words, turning off inflammation and upregulating immune function. And Herbert Benson's lab at Mass General has shown similar results, but they have also shown changes in metabolic genes and also in genes involved in stress. So clearly, again, we're seeing that the genes that are involved and are affected by these practices are consistent with what we see behaviorally with these practices. We see suppression of stress, we see a reduction of emotional reactivity, we see increase in attention, and we see improvement in immune function. Now, one of the things that I keep coming back to is this whole idea of stress management. Virtually every study that has looked at stress that has used a meditation or yoga intervention has shown improvements in stress. And so now we have reviews of this, and this is actually one of the biggest reasons why people practice yoga. This was a survey study we did of beginners yoga practitioners published a few years ago. And stress management is virtually 75% of people are coming to yoga for stress management. So it is a central drive to yoga's potential for people. And, of course, we now have many papers published, so not surprisingly, there are reviews of this. And the reviews summarize this and conclude that yoga is a promising modality for stress management. So it plays a key role. And stress is very, very important because stress plays a huge role in the etiology of diseases and the maintenance of symptoms of diseases. And you'd be surprised how many diseases have stress as a major component. In other words, the biggest drive for the appearance of depression is actually chronic unmanaged stress. Type 2 diabetics have high levels of chronic stress. So it is very common in many disease states and actually contributes to the severity of symptoms in many diseases. So in that same population of beginner students that we evaluated, we gave them the perceived stress scale before and after their yoga beginners program. Not surprisingly, we got a statistically significant improvement in perceived stress. And in fact, I've been working, a large part of my work now is with the College Center for Yoga and Health, in which we're conducting studies of programs that they are running for employees, for corporate workers, for frontline providers. And this is a study that was done in a residential program at the Kapala Yoga Center. We brought people in for 5 days. Not surprisingly, it's a great environment, so not surprisingly, they had reductions in stress at the end of the program and increases in resilience at the end of the program. So that, of course, is a spa effect, you could argue. But 6 months later, they still had gains in perceived stress and actually maintained gains certainly in resilience. So the skills, the yoga skills they learned in that 5-day retreat actually manifested in long-term gains when they went back to their home environment. Frankly, counselor, I don't care how stressful this is for your client. Tell them to get out of that damn yoga position. So it is really a hallmark of yoga, this whole idea of stress management. We're going to come to that in a moment. Now, another key aspect of yoga practice is the development of mind-body awareness. The yoga instructor in a yoga class is constantly saying, keep your focus, pay attention, meditate. That is the focus of attention. That inculcates mind-body awareness. And we have evidence that that does increase in long-term yoga practitioners. And we measure what we call mindfulness, which is that mind-body awareness. So this is a study looking at long-term yoga practitioners. And when they looked at mindfulness, it was strongly correlated with practice frequency and years of practice. In other words, the more you practice yoga, the more you become mindful. Evidence from another study. In this study, they had two groups, basically yoga practitioners and non-yoga practitioners. And they divided the yoga practitioners into people who were marginally practicing, those who practiced moderately, and those who had high levels of practice. Now, the control group scored on the Freiburg Mindfulness Inventory, scored 78 and 77 in the marginal. So marginal yoga doesn't do much for mindfulness. But as soon as you start moderate yoga practice, you jump from 77 to 84. And if you do high levels of yoga practice, you jump further to 92. So clearly, there's a dose-dependent effect. The more you practice yoga, the more you're going to develop and increase mindfulness and mind-body awareness. And we've shown this on the short term. Those are long-term practitioners. Those are long practices. This is a 6-week intervention at the Tanglewood Music Center in Western Massachusetts. We took summer students who came to their training program with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and it's a stressful program. We gave them 6 weeks of yoga, and we measured their mindfulness. And indeed, they increased in levels of mindfulness compared to a control group from the same group that did not practice yoga. And subscales of that questionnaire, the mindfulness questionnaire, showed improvements in observing and awareness compared to the control group. So the mindfulness and mind-body awareness immediately improves with yoga practice. And we see this as well in this Kripalu program, and this is a program that we now took into the business setting, into the corporate setting, and into a corporate program of yoga practices, and we saw increases in mindfulness. This is a trend because we're just in the process of getting a larger sample size, and you can see also the trend in all of the subscales of that mindfulness questionnaire. Now, finally, I'd like to talk about the contemplative nature of yoga. And actually, historically, yoga was a contemplative practice. The goal of yoga practice was to achieve samadhi, these unitive, these deep and profound unitive states of consciousness. And I see yoga practice on a temporal domain. So in the short term, there's, and this happens over the course of minutes, certainly over yoga class, there's the psychophysiological reduction in arousal, sympathetic drive goes down, there's a sense of physical and mental well-being. This happens over literally minutes, and this is so-called relaxation responses coined by Herbert Benson. It's the body's innate ability to reduce that psychophysiological arousal, to bring the stress systems down, to bring emotional reactivity down. Now, as people practice over weeks and months, it's a learned skill. So they start to develop more mind-body awareness, resilience to stress, equanimity in the face of emotions, and this whole construct of self-regulation. People become enabled. They're able to handle stress better. They're able to handle their emotions more effectively. They're better in terms of their mindfulness. They're more mind-body aware. And then finally, over months and years, what I think happens is actually a psychological, philosophical transformation. Not happens to everybody, but a lot of people experience this, and it's a change in life perspective. People actually use the phrase, yoga changed my life. It's that profound of a change. When people change their values, they change their view on life, they change their life purpose and meaning. They go from a materialistic to a more non-materialistic goal in life. And this is a very profound transformation that takes place. And where it comes from, I think, is through some experiences that happen during the meditation and the yoga, which are brief glimpses of this unitive state of consciousness. It is so profound a state that it actually changes people on a permanent basis. Once you've tasted that experience, you can't go back. And so people actually make profound changes experiencing that deep contemplative state. And we have some evidence for that. The evidence for this, of course, is much weaker. And so this is a study we did with long-term yoga practitioners. This was an internet survey. We showed that experiences of transcendence were strongly correlated with amount of practice time. Total lifetime hours, total candle years, and how many hours per week they were practicing. This was a study that was conducted a number of years ago on the yoga ashram residents, asking them, compared to non-ashram residents, where they were, what their experiences were. And this is the percentage of respondents agreeing to these statements.